Hello and welcome back to the channel. So, a quick build update on the 1981 BMW R100CS. I'm trying to do a video a week if I can at the moment, because with a week's worth of tinkering, that probably gives me about enough to make a decent video. This is very much a project that's having to fit in and around all the other stuff happening in my life at the moment, the job, family time, all that kind of stuff. So it's not moving at a massive pace, but with a weekly update, there's probably enough to make for a decent little kind of roundup of what's been going on. And actually, this week has been pretty cool because for the first time in a long time, the bike is now back up on her own 2 feet. So the front and the back wheel is now in place. And for the first time in a long time, I was able to kind of stand back and look at it and go, wow, it actually looks like a motorbike. I know it's a silly little thing, but it's just one of those kind of landmark moments where you're like, yes, we kind of got to a really good place. Getting there was a little bit complicated. There were a few things to get sorted in order to get it back up on its feet. So we'll talk about that. And then we'll talk about what's coming up next in terms of all the other bits and pieces that need to happen before we can finally get ourselves in the position where we're going to press that red button and hopefully it doesn't all explode. So last update, I think it was the swing arm and all that. So the swing arm's now in place, taking care to make sure that's all lined up in the back section of the frame. I think there's like a 3.9mm gap either side. And then you've got to put those pivot bolts in place, making sure that everything remains even, and then just tighten it up with the lock nuts to secure it all. So all that's done. So with the swing arm in place, the next thing to do was to get the final drive installed on the back of the swing arm. So obviously these BMWs are shaft driven. So there's a shaft that runs from the output flange on the transmission all the way through the swing arm. And then there's a bevel gearing system that then ultimately turns the back wheel. So final drive is also the host of the rear drum brake. So before I put the drive on the bike, I wanted to make sure that I got my brake shoes in place. I figured out the best way to do it for me was to kind of connect the two springs that hold each half of the brake shoes together, kind of hold it like a V shape, and then just kind of pry it over the pivot pin and the cam actuator. Took a little bit of fumbling to get it in place, but really not that difficult. You just be careful that it doesn't suddenly all ping apart and smack you in the face halfway through doing it, because those springs are under a reasonable amount of tension. So yeah, not too difficult getting that done. There is a cam that goes all the way through the final drive, and that ultimately connects to your brake pedal through an adjuster link. Then that also has a couple of O-rings on it because there's obviously transmission fluid running through the final drive, and the cam actually goes all the way through the housing. So there's 2 O-rings that also I wanted to replace before putting that back in, just to make sure that everything stays as tight as it possibly can. We don't get any leaks, because fluid leaking would be bad. It's going to go all over your brake drum shoes. So yeah, don't want to do that. So yeah, final drive bolted onto the back of the bike. There's a little gasket that you have to put between the swing arm and the mating surface on the final drive. I don't think all of these bikes have that. I think the monolevers don't have it, but certainly my bike does. And I think most of the bikes with dual shocks have that little gasket. So you've got to make sure that's in place. And then there's just 4 nuts that secure the drive onto the back of the swing arm via the 4 studs on the drive. And you do have to be a little bit careful when you're putting this in place, because there is kind of only one way that it fits, and it fits absolutely dead flush to the back of the swing arm. It is possible to push this up to the swing arm and there just to be a tiny little gap that you wouldn't really notice. And you've got to be careful that that's not there, because if you start tightening up those bolts and those teeth aren't perfectly aligned, you could get something suddenly kind of snap into place and you could chip a tooth or something like that. That would be bad. So yeah, you've got to make sure it's properly flush up against the back of the swing arm before you start putting any torque through those nuts. And they are a little bit fiddly to do up, just because there isn't much clearance in there. You won't be able to get a big socket on there or anything like that. So you have to use, I think it's a 10mm spanner, and just do them up as tight as you can until your hand hurts. Get them nice and tight, do them in a crisscross pattern, and yeah, it's all done. So with that in place, the next bit, which is another right old faff, is to connect the universal joint to the output flange on the transmission. And again, to do that, there are 4 special bolts. And now I believe these bolts are a one-time use bolt, because I think they're stretch bolts. I think the threads on them stretch lightly. Ordered a new set of those from Motorworks, and they come with this red pre-coat on them as well. So that's effectively a thread locker, which is going to hold them in place and make sure that they don't come loose. There's obviously a lot of force going through these bolts. So yeah, getting those in place, you've got to kind of line up the section of the universal joint to the output flange. You have to put your transmission in neutral, kind of turn it and line it up until the bolt holes line up. And then being very, very, very careful that you don't drop a bolt down your drive shaft. Kind of get in there with your fingers, finger tighten them as much as you can. Keep rotating the shaft until you've got all of them in there finger tight. And then you're just going to have to go through that process of putting it in 5th gear, torquing each one up, putting it back in neutral, spinning it round, back in 5th, torque it up. You get the idea. Now, of course, before you do this, you want to be absolutely certain that you haven't forgotten to put your rubber bellows on the back of the swing arm. Because if you tighten up the universal joint to the output flange without those in place, then you've got to undo it all again and re-thread lock them and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, 100% make sure that's in place before you do it. With that in place, you can then move on to the subframe. And I'm talking about this like it's some kind of procedure. This is just the way I did it. You could do it in kind of multiple ways. So yeah, with the drive shaft all secured up, moved on to the subframe. That's actually really easy. I started off with the bolts at the bottom, got those kind of loosely tightened up, and then just pivoted the whole thing up. And then there's those 2 kind of big countersunk bolts that go all the way through the subframe and then through the frame, and then they kind of bolt on to the outside of the frame. Now, there are some special plastic nut caps that you can get to tidy up the look of this, because otherwise you're going to end up with exposed bolts sticking out of your frame, which doesn't look particularly great. So yeah, you can get a proper kind of plastic nut cap just to make that look nice and tidy once you've torqued it all up, which I did, and it looks lovely. So with the subframe in place and the final drive on, it was then time to do the rear suspension. Now, you do have to make sure you've done your final drive and your subframe first, because obviously that's going to give you your mounting points for the rear shocks on the dual shock bikes. Now, I've gone for Hagon Nitro shocks on this bike, and they are a little bit of a diversion away from the somewhat more kind of slender, coney dial-a-ride shocks that I took off. They were pretty tired. They definitely seen better days. So I wanted to get some new shocks and decided to go for these Hagon shocks. And I think they look absolutely fantastic on this bike. They are made of solid stainless steel, the stainless steel spring, stainless steel shock body. I think the mounting points are actually aluminium, but the whole thing just looks great, like kind of real chunky and industrial, and this bike can definitely take it. The thing is, with any kind of rear shock installation, it's always a little bit of trial and error in terms of lining the whole thing up. You've got to be quite patient with it, just being careful not to force things, because like with all this stuff, it's only, you know, microns of difference needed between getting the bolt to easily slide in and absolutely getting completely and utterly stuck. So you've got to make sure that you can line up your swing arm and get it just at the right height, so that the everything lines up, the little kind of eyelets in the top and bottom of the shocks line up, and you can get those bolts in place. It was a little bit of a squeeze getting it done, but I would definitely try to avoid, you know, reaching for the big flathead screwdrivers and trying to lever the things in place, or whacking them with mallets and things like that. You might need to give it a little tap, but I managed to do it, thankfully, with no tools of mass destruction. Nothing got destroyed in the process of doing it. If you get really stuck, it might be better to put the back wheel on first, and then you can kind of just jack it up, and the bike will compress slightly under its weight, and that might give you just that tiny little fraction of space that you need to get it done. I actually had to back off all of the preload from the springs on these shocks in order to just give myself enough kind of wiggle room to be able to kind of just bump the shocks up slightly and compress them a little bit so that it all snapped into place. And it did. So very happy with that. Now, I know these shocks aren't going to be for everyone. They do look a little bit more, industrial and chunky, and that's because they are. And there's a little bit of an issue that I might need to try and find a solution for because of the diameter of these shocks. I'm going to be running the factory style BMW luggage racks. Now I'm going to be using the Trip Machine suede Warrior 2 bags on the back of this. I'm not going to go with the original cases. But because these shocks are a little bit wider, I'm running into a clearance issue with the arm of the frame as it passes the shock and then bolts to these little arms on the back of the actual motorbike. So what I'm going to do is, and I've tested this with a bunch of washers, as you can see here, is just get a little 5mm standoff spacer that's going to stand between the frame and the arm of the luggage rack. And that's just going to kick it out far enough so that as that arm is sweeping past the shock, it just gives it a little bit more clearance. Now, I think I might have just got away with it, but it was just a little bit too tight for my liking. So just kicking it out by 5mm on the frame. And then there's that big long bolt that connects it to the rear subframe. Again, I'm just going to put a little bit of a spacer on that as well and use a slightly longer bolt. So again, it's just slightly kicked out at the back and slightly kicked out at the bottom, only by a few millimeters. It's just enough so that it clears that shock. That's the only thing to consider if you're going to go for a shock with a slightly wider diameter spring and you want to run the original factory luggage. With all that in place, the shocks in place, it was then time to move on to the rear wheel. Now, one would imagine that this would be a pretty easy and straightforward thing to do, and indeed it should be. Got the back wheel in place, went to slide in the rear spindle, and would it go in? Well, it went in most of the way, and then it got absolutely stuck. And there was seemingly nothing I could do to get this spindle to slide all the way in to the boss of the swing arm. It's the simple things in life sometimes. It's just like, what? Why is this happening? What's going on? Now, again, the temptation at this point might be to start reaching for hammers and things like that and trying to smash it through. But honestly, this thing was just butting right up against the boss of the swing arm. It wouldn't go in. Now, as you can see on this unit, it's a new stainless steel spindle, and it has this tiny little machined shoulder on the left-hand side. Now, when I took my old spindle off my bike, it didn't have this little shoulder on it at all. It was just a straight through piece. I mean, it obviously had the big shoulder that pushes up against the wheel bearings, but it didn't have this tiny little machined lip in it. So this thing's getting caught up on the boss of the swing arm, so it won't go through. So I'm thinking I must have the wrong part. So I'm getting in touch with Motorworks, going, what's going on? This part doesn't fit my bike. I'm doing more research, trying to find different versions of this spindle that doesn't have that machined lip on it. And it turns out that pretty much all of the new reproductions of this spindle all are designed in exactly the same way, and they all have that little lip on there, which was never there on the original bike. So I'm just like, what's going on? It doesn't work. Anyway, as I said, rather than kind of reaching for the hammers and things like that, I kind of took a bit of a breath. In the meantime, I've been getting emails back from people going, no, it definitely should fit. So I just kind of ran my finger around the outer lip of the boss of the swing arm and discovered the tiniest little burr just on the edge of the boss. So I thought, what the hell, I'll just grab a little bit of wet and dry, just knock that off a little bit. And honestly, with about 30 to 50 seconds worth of sanding, grab the spindle again, and it just flew straight through. It just goes to show, like, the tiniest little bit of metal standing in the way of something with such a tight fit is either a complete red light or it's just going to fly through. So with that, just sanded back ever so slightly, a little bit of grease, pushed it straight in. Honestly, I went all the way around the mulberry bush 3 times on this, trying to figure it out. And it was the simplest, smallest, little stupid thing that was standing in my way. Anyway, all sorted. So the back wheel's back on, all torqued up. And for the first time, gives me the opportunity to kind of stand back and go, yes, I'm happy with these black powder coated wheels. I think they look brilliant, especially up against the nicely vapor blasted final drive and those stainless steel Hagen shocks. I'm happy with how this looks. So then moving on to the front wheel, no real dramas there. The only thing I had to do to get the front wheel ready was to prepare it with the new brake discs. So these are EBC ProLights. These are floating discs, which basically means we've got these little bobbins and a tiny little gap between the friction surface of the disc and the main hub in order to control the heat a little bit better. The original solid Brembo discs that I took off this bike were quite badly warped, and that's one of the consequences of those units going through all of those heat cycles. And without that heat management that you get from a floating disc, you do have a higher percentage risk of eventually the discs becoming warped. So hopefully these will last for a long time. You would hope so, because they were flipping expensive. Getting them on the wheel really easy. You've got these 5 long bolts that go all the way through, and you just use a lock nut to bolt those in place. Now, I use Nylox on this, and I do actually have a set of proper M8, what do you call them? All metal locking nuts, which I decided not to use just because I don't think we're going to run into any heat problems because of the design of these discs. And with these bolts being stainless steel and those nuts being stainless steel, and with all the kind of brake dust and stuff going on down there, I didn't want to risk getting them completely galled up by using an all metal locking nut. But I'll keep an eye on them, see how we go. Can always change them out if need be. But at the moment, we've got Nylox on there all torqued up using the proper specs and a crisscross pattern, as you do. So once the discs are in place, just a case of getting the height of the forks set so that you can perfectly kind of roll the wheel in and then just push the spindle in place. That's pretty straightforward. And then just bolt it up using the special washer and the nut for that spindle. And there it is. It's all in place. Everything is looking absolutely fantastic. I'm delighted to have got to this point. The next thing to think about doing is actually getting this engine to turn over and start up. Now, it's been sat for quite a long time, has this bike. It's got no oil in it at the moment. So I've got to put oil in it. I've got to put the sump on and put the strainer in and all that kind of stuff. So that's going to be fun getting under there and doing all of that. But it's been sat around for a while. These heads have been sat around for quite a long time with new pistons in and new Nickersill and all that. So the whole thing feels quite tight. I have managed to get it to rotate over with a screwdriver in the flywheel, moved it over a full rotation, also been able to bump it a little bit on the back wheel. I don't want to do too much of that before I've put oil in it. It feels like it's on the tight side, but I think it's just a combination of the fact that it's been sat around for so long and it hasn't got any oil in it, and it's basically a 0 hours engine. This thing has not ever started in its kind of current setup, so there's a little bit of tightness there, but hopefully we'll be able to get this thing to fire up and turn over. The first thing to do would be just to verify that we've got oil pressure in the system, so fill it with oil, spark plugs grounded, turn it over, confirm that we've got oil at the heads. Then we can put the plugs back in, a little bit of fuel in the carbs, and see if we can get it to fire up. And then once that's done, we've got to do all the balancing, we've got to do the timing. Obviously, we've got to set all the valve clearances and things like that. I think they're already done, but I've just got to confirm that that's all good. And then we're in a happy place, but there's still quite a few steps to go through to get us to that point. And I will, of course, keep you updated with another video this time next week on the channel. That's it for now. Until the next one, ride safe.